Welcome to Drinks with Defenders. I'm Addie B. Plate.
And I'm Kayla Murphy. We're two law school friends turned criminal defense attorneys turned podcast hosts.
We're here in this space because we now work in separate offices and miss collaborating with each other.
We've been talking about creating a podcast for years where we talk about the complexities of the criminal justice system, the aspects of it that we grapple with, and the importance of what we do.
At the end of a long work week, we want to sit down, have a drink with each other, and talk about the rabbit holes of criminal defense, just like we always have. So let's get into it. Cheers!
Okay, are we here? Can everybody hear each other?
We're doing the damn thing.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. All right. So what's up? What has everybody been up to? What's the 411?
What's the hot gossip?
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's see. It's been a minute since we've all chatted. So I feel like life is new. I don't know, work stuff always. I think, and Kayla, you can kind of entertain this train of thought as much as, as you want to, but you're the person who asked. What's new since the last time we were on the podcast is we have a new president. That's new. I think the political climate in the US is, I wouldn't say it's new, but I think it's moving at a quicker pace than we probably expected. I think it's the global trend politically. I think is certainly new. I think that a lot of other countries, if anybody's keeping up with elections worldwide, are kind of following in the same trend as what's happening in the US. I think that pivot in terms of value shift is new globally. Obviously, it's a regression into, I think, some ideologies that have been held by other governments that are reminiscent of World War II. I think that that's very on point. Unfortunately, it's new in our lifetimes, I think. And yeah, not a new political climate in terms of, I think that's been on trend for where America has been headed the last few years. But I think the pace in which things are changing is certainly new here. And I think we would be
I feel you.
And I think we would be doing a big disservice to our listeners to not just be blunt about that. I think we've shared that our jobs are inherently political. Granted, I don't think politics is our specialty on this podcast, but we can't ignore the ways in which our profession overlaps with that. I think it would be an abuse of our privilege, an abuse of our education, and really an abuse of the space that we've created to not talk about it. I think it's important and big enough for us to dedicate maybe a future episode to that and talk about the rule of law and the challenges that I think the second Trump administration is providing. But I would direct our listeners for the time being to go back to the Millennial Review. I had my friend Justin Ackerman on this podcast. His podcast, The Millennial Review, is a political podcast. I think he's doing great coverage with what's going on. And I really enjoy his perspective on it. But just to be...
Yeah, on that same note, Addie, I'm going to totally forget it. So sorry to cut you off.
No,
but I have
good.
also been like... really fixated on this idea of parallels between the rise of Hitler and what Germany looked like in 1933 and today. And Chat GPT and I have an ongoing discussion about it. For every new thing that happens, I ask it to draw parallels, and it's been fascinating. I've also been listening to Behind the Bastards. Have you heard of that podcast?
I have not.
Okay. It's really good. And he has a 2-part series on, what was it called? It's like how good people let the Nazis rise or something like that. Anyway, he's just, again, talking about 1933 Germany and how, how it all went down. And so it's very depressing.
I appreciate that. I admittedly spent yesterday at a used bookstore with one of my old colleagues and friends, and we went and were looking for banned books and books that I think are some important historical context for what's going on right now as well. I think that that's just something I would encourage friends of our podcast or people who listen in to really engage with us. You don't have to take our words as truth. You certainly don't have to. You get to pick the media that you consume. But I would just encourage everybody to think really critically about what's going on. And there's a lesson in history that I think we really need to be focusing on. And the parallels, I think, certainly between Nazi Germany as well as Napoleon. I think, Trump is pulling quotes and inspiration from other political leaders. I think his team, as much as if you agree with him or disagree with him, I think that you have to admit his team is pulling some old pages out of some very old books. And it's obvious. And so I agree with you, Kayla. I think that the parallels are hard to ignore. And I think that, the solace of people who have gone through similar struggles before us is something that I think we all need to kind of lean into. And then find your source of community with people who are engaging. I think that's really important right now too. I think the divisiveness in America is something that's been an ongoing trend. I think I'm constantly stuck between feeling very polarized from people, but also wanting to find ways in which I can connect with people to get us back to, I think, a tone in which we're focusing more on what we have in common and how to promote our common good instead of just being self-interested. But I think it's really hard considering how polarized our country is right now. And so going back and turning to the words and lessons from history past, I think is something that's going to be continually important as we kind of navigate some unprecedented times for us, but certainly similar struggles that other people have endured.
Amen. Really well said, Addie. Um, well, anything else to report while we're just trying to enjoy I don't know, hopefully not the last good days. I don't know if good days, but you know what I mean? Like we can go outside right now, which is good. What's up? What have you been doing? Have you been distracting yourself with anything or just doom scrolling?
I do a fair bit of doom scrolling.
Yeah.
I think that I'm trying to. I think in the news with me, I think the way I'm kind of absorbing it is hard because I feel like everything's moving so quickly, and I feel like if I'm not acting, I'm really like contributing to the problem. But I'm also trying to, uh, I guess, process change and news as a lawyer. And for me, that means just kind of information gathering and trying to like collectively organize and find ways in which I can be of help to people. As a practitioner in Idaho, I think that certainly there's a lot of change on the horizon for the state in which I practice. And just trying to spend time with people who are in my community in terms of have similar values and just enjoying their company, whether it's via like book club or just like going to dinner with all my other attorney friends and trying to enjoy our community outside of just like work, I think is really important because it allows you to kind of communicate about the other stuff going on. Aside from that, I'm trying to have a balanced life, but I think that's something that I continually struggle with as a person. I'm wanting to find a hobby. I think maybe like pottery or something like that might be something I get into this year. We'll see. I got really into like painting and stuff when I was in law school. Admittedly, I'm kind of a creative person that never really explored much of the artistic lifestyle. Like I never really took hard art classes or anything like that in school. I wish I had because I do enjoy creative outlets and I think it's just a really different way of using your brain. So I think I might like try to this year might be kind of the year of like exploration into just something that's completely different, that's like a little bit more hands-on, whether it's painting or pottery. I think when I have a house one day, I would love to have like a wheel and do like actual like making pottery in my garage. Like one day I'm
I
going to
can
just
so
kind of
see
be,
that.
yeah, one day I'm going to be done with
You're
being
wearing
so serious.
overalls.
Yes, exactly. And I have like big glasses on and I'm just like blasting music and like having like doing tarot and pottery in my garage.
Ooh,
That's my like when I'm older, that'll be
retirement
me.
plan.
Retirement plan, channeling the part of my personality that's like Stevie Nicks adjacent. What about you? What are you up to? What's new in your household and life?
Yeah, man, I've been doing a lot of doom scrolling too. I recently found the subreddit uh claps are claps. It's
Hmm.
talking about like the upcoming global catastrophe, global warming and the climate
Yeah.
apocalypse, and in conjunction with the rise of authoritarian regimes all over the world. It's just all very depressing. I did a deep dive on like the what is it called? Um, the cities, satellite cities. No, what are they? Do you know what I'm talking about?
No.
The
Should I?
okay, no, it's okay. I'll get back to you on it after I do a deeper dive.
Do they
Um,
have actual
anyway, man,
satellites?
no. Oh fuck, network cities.
Network cities.
Okay,
Okay.
yes, okay. I'm gonna just sound like a conspiracy theorist right now,
I
but
love a
long story
conspiracy
short,
theory.
look into JD Vance, the
Oh
people
God.
that like these tech bros, man, and like their ideologies are wild. And it's just fascinating to look into like some of the shit that they talk about in conjunction with our, the people who are in power and just what they want the future to look like. Um, anyways, um, we
JD
can
Vance. I feel like
Dude,
I just
he
have
made
to
me look like such a fucking idiot by liking his goddamn book. And it just pisses me off every time I remember. I'm like, I recommended that book to people. I read it twice. Don't look at me like that. I know. I liked it. I know. I'm out here looking like a fucking idiot. What are you
I
going to
feel
do?
like the people have been just bamboozled by the fact that he is a man who doesn't have terrible eyebrows. And that is a conspiracy that
That's
I
fair.
will take with me to the grave. Like that man would not have had the rise if he had had worse eyebrows. Um, and you just brought me back to like the other 2 points I wanted to
So
make.
fascinated. Like
I
what?
have
The eyebrow
the
theory?
eyebrow conspiracy theory is a real one for me. But
Okay.
what I will say is that with some of the things that are going on, and again, there's going to be people that listen to our podcast that are not in the same camp as us in terms of politics or values or whatever it may be. But the thing I want to say is that I've just kind of gotten to a point with climate crises where I'm so past asking people if they like believe in climate change. And it's more like, do you understand climate change or do you
Yeah.
understand tariffs? Like that's where I think the conversation, I think that we're so, back to again, the like divisiveness and polarization. Like we're so wanting to just be argumentative with other people in terms of instead like having a collaborative conversation about like, do people genuinely understand these things that are not as abstract as they kind of are talking points on people's political platforms? And Kayla, to your
Yeah.
point about the JD Vance book, listen, I think a lot of people are feeling kind of tricked in different ways. I was talking about, and we should really probably talk about Project 2025 at some point, because I know we had
A
mentioned
whole
that.
episode for sure. It's
Yeah, because
specifically related to criminal justice and like
yes.
the plans that they've got in store for us and our people.
Yeah,
Some dark
I think
shit.
that we should dig into that because I think that the rule book was out there. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it's time we kind of start taking that seriously. Um, Yeah, I think it's one of those things too where again, I'm just going to express gratitude for this podcast. It is going to be a really tumultuous time to be a lawyer. And I think it's going to be a tumultuous time for a lot of folks. I have a lot of sympathy for people who are going through professional and employment struggles because of what's happening with our government. My partner is one of those people. What happened to USAID definitely affected my household. But we're not alone in that. There's other people who are losing their jobs who are park rangers or federal employees or whatever it may be. And it is going to be a really big struggle, I think, for a lot of different professions. And I think that I just come back to gratitude that we have this space because it is going to be a hell of a ride, I think, to be a lawyer for the foreseeable future in the United States.
Yeah, you are so right. Okay, well, on that note, shall we dive
Get
in?
into it.
Hey guys, I know it's like 1 p.m. my time and 11 a.m. your time. A little bit more acceptable to drink probably where I am than where you are. I don't know, unless you're doing like a Sunday brunch. I'm drinking coffee from Crema, a local place here in Nashville. What are you guys drinking?
First of all, what would you rate it?
Oh, it's an 11 out of 10. It's like the best spot.
Ooh.
Yeah.
What's your order?
Today I got a drip coffee because it was like a special winter light roast blend that they're doing.
Damn.
But Faith got an iced vanilla latte with oat milk.
That sounds good.
Yum.
Absolutely.
Girl with good taste. I have a Kirkland brand sparkling water here, unflavored. Good stuff.
We love a hydrated queen.
What do you got going on, Addie?
Oh, I am just drinking an iced water.
Okay. Flat.
I appreciate your commentary, Clark. It is way too early for me to be engaging in anything more fun. And I just also feel like I've been neglecting. I'm like a plant. I really am bad at watering myself.
I get that.
Like I just really refuse to take care of myself. I'm a neglected houseplant. Normally just drinking coffee all day. So I'm like, all right, I should probably engage in some self-care while we get into it.
For sure.
So, in this episode of Drinks with Defenders, we're going to be talking about the case of Jamal Moore. We spoke with his wife, Gabriella, on our previous episode. But just to remind you guys, Jamal was convicted of second-degree murder and felony firearm for the 2012 murder of 17-year-old Carlos Wesley in Detroit, Michigan. Jamal was sentenced to 20 to 40 years for murder and 2 years for the firearm conviction. He appealed and he argued that there were insufficient evidence against him, but the Court of Appeals upheld his conviction. So we really just want to be upfront here. Like covering this case has been a real challenge for us. Our initial hope was to produce like a multi-part investigative series, but we quickly realized that we did not have the time, like research and journalistic training, like really necessary to do a case like this justice. And, with our work, it was really just too much to take on. So really in this episode, we're going to just provide a primer on Jamal's case, highlight a few of the most compelling pieces of information that we uncovered, and just really encourage people to take a deeper dive because we really just only scratched the surface. So the information that we did have access to included some court transcripts and discovery materials provided by Gabriella Moore, a Michigan Court of Appeals opinion. And Jamal also wrote a book called If Pain Was a Person. So we're not here to argue guilt or innocence. Our goal is really to just present some key facts, spark curiosity, and again, invite listeners to just always think critically about criminal cases. And after we talk about Jamal's case, we'll explore some broader issues within the criminal legal system and factors that can impact the integrity of convictions. So let's get into it. Addie?
So again, kind of just a case overview. And I just want to, again, briefly before I kind of touch on the case, express gratitude for both Jamal and Gabriella for reaching out to us. I agree with your sentiment about thinking critically about cases. I just also want to encourage people to just remember that these are real people. These are people's stories. These are people that have tried to have a relationship with our podcast, and we are so grateful for both of them. But again, we're not here to convince any people of, changing their mind or having opinions on this, but to just be interested in their story and kind of make an assessment of what you think for yourselves. So again, Jamal was convicted in a bench trial of the second-degree murder charge and the felony firearm for the killing that Kayla mentioned. The court sentenced him accordingly. Again, with the appeal, the Court of Appeals in Michigan upheld the sufficiency of the evidence. And then the facts of the case are kind of as follows. On August 21st, 2012, Carlos Wesley was found dead from a gunshot wound to the back of his head while house sitting at his uncle's home. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide, but could not determine the exact time of death. Based on the Court of Appeals opinion, key evidence considered by the trial court included an eyewitness account. Carlos's girlfriend testified that Carlos and Moore visited her at approximately 11 o'clock p.m. on August 19th, 2012, which is 2 days prior to the killing. She recalled Carlos carrying a revolver and that Jamal Moore was talking about selling drugs and killing people, though this was not in her initial police statement. There's an alleged confession from Jamal to his mother. His mom's name is Charlotte White. She testified that on November 2nd, 2012, Moore admitted to shooting Carlos, stating that they had been robbing people together and that Carlos planned to blame Moore if caught. She did not report this confession until January 2013. Additionally, White later indicated that her boyfriend had also been in the vehicle during Jamal's confession. Her boyfriend indicated that he did not recall this conversation, but admitted to suffering from memory issues. There's some recorded jail calls. I'm just going to kind of add some commentary real quick. I think it always surprises people that calls that people make at the jail are recorded. Unless it's somebody calling their attorney, anything that people can say while they're incarcerated can be recorded. So this isn't abnormal. Just wanted to kind of add that piece if you're not familiar with stories involving incarcerated folks. But in any event, Jamal Moore ends up incarcerated. And while he was waiting trial, his jail calls were recorded, one of which indicated that he was discussing his mom's statement and referring to her as the, quote, only problem witness, end quote, in the case. He also suggested that she change her story, quote. There's a letter that was also involved. So Jamal's mom also indicated that she wrote an anonymous letter at his son's request, indicating that someone else was responsible. So again, kind of that changing her story thought, I think is further reflected there. I think all in all, Jamal's mom's participation was something that I think the court found interesting. And from our perspective, I think it's worth noting that his mom did not seem that she wanted to testify, that she didn't want to testify against her son. But before agreeing to testify at the preliminary examination, the trial court judge held her in contempt of court and placed her in handcuffs and then lockup. So contempt of court is always interesting when it gets involved. I think that just an additional kind of commentary there, I think from our perspective is witnesses sometimes don't want to be involved, especially, family members or different people that people have relationships with. They kind of get...
I would say more often than not. Wouldn't you,
Yes.
Addie, with like domestic violence allegations?
Yeah, I think more often than not, in my experience, like alleged victims don't really want to be involved in the same way as sometimes people think that they do. And then, in just other types of criminal cases, people's friends and families, if they're having to testify against their loved one, they have a really difficult time doing so. And I, again, just wanted to share, please remember, these are real people. These are people that have family members. These are people that have lives. It is really difficult to navigate those relationships with the criminal case going on. And so I think that as we're kind of considering this case, I would just ask everyone to have a little bit of empathy for some of these characters, because it is really not that simple. I think we got a flavor of that with Gabriella, certainly someone who loves her husband, certainly somebody who I think has a significant interest in just advocating for somebody that she cares about. But there's other people in this trial that have relationships with other people in the case. And I think that is sometimes very, very messy and very, very complicated. The court and the prosecution always has an interest in trying to get the evidence before the court and before the jury. So there's different mechanisms to kind of force people to be involved, such as contempt, or in this case, contempt and subpoena, because the court initially held Jamal's mom in contempt. But my understanding is that to ensure her appearance at trial, which was a later hearing, the prosecuting attorney subpoenaed Jamal's mom and placed her as a material witness on their witness list. So that also kind of, I think, forced somebody to be present in a way that it's kind of hard for people to dodge subpoena power as well. It's not something that is taken lightly. So that's going on as well. This is also a case with an alibi. Their alibi defenses are interesting. Alibis, just as a kind of, again, a side commentary, when an alibi is presented, there's additional disclosure by the defense that has to happen when somebody's presenting an alibi. And in this case, the alibi was through two mentors, James Thorpe and Leonard Gibson, who claimed that he was not with Carlos at the time of the murder, meaning that Jamal was not with Carlos at the time Carlos was killed.
The Court of Appeals ultimately reasoned that the trial court determines the credibility of the witnesses. So basically what they're saying is the judge who oversaw this trial is best situated to look at these witnesses, right? To see who appears to be telling the truth, right? Who they find to be credible. Here, they reasoned that, okay, it looks like the trial court determined that the mom was credible and that the alibi witnesses were not. And so we're not going to be second guessing the court's determination of credibility. So ultimately, they disagreed that the evidence was insufficient to support conviction and held that a reasonable trier of fact could conclude that Jamal Moore acted with malice and that the evidence, including his confession and motive, were sufficient. So looking through some of the evidence that was not included in this opinion. How do I preface this? So Gabriella gave us a bunch of documents. It appeared to be a bunch of discovery, as well as some court transcripts. From the court transcripts that we found, as well as from the Court of Appeals opinion, it did not appear that this evidence that I'm about to talk about came up in the trial. Whether that was a strategic decision by the attorney, or if the evidence was not turned over, or if we're missing something with, in all of the information that we've reviewed, like it didn't come up. We don't know why. So DNA evidence and an unidentified glove. This was the most compelling thing that I personally found while reviewing all of this information. So a right-hand glove was recovered from the crime scene. And you guys may recall Carlos was staying with his uncle when he was tragically murdered. Well, I'm sorry, not staying with his uncle. His uncle was out of town and I think he was house sitting for his uncle. And so when his uncle came back and, uncovered this tragic situation, he was asked about this glove and he stated that he didn't own it and he couldn't explain why it was there at the crime scene, which was in the living room of his uncle's home. DNA testing indicated that there were at least two contributors to DNA on this glove, and at least one of those contributors was a male, but neither Carlos nor Jamal Moore matched this DNA. Again, unclear if this was presented to the trial court. It doesn't appear so based on our review of the Court of Appeals opinion, and that's weird. Another interesting consideration is the complicated relationship between Jamal and his mother.
Absolutely.
If you read Jamal's book, he and his mother had a very kind of tumultuous relationship, and she had, some behaviors and some it was, I encourage you all to read the book. It wasn't like a typical mother-son relationship. And I think that their difficult and complex dynamics could have contributed to, their interactions and perhaps her testimony. So, in conclusion, I guess we would just say that we think that this case raises important questions, and we really encourage listeners to look deeper into the facts, examine all perspectives, and to think critically about the criminal legal system, rather than just making snap judgments about people's innocence or guilt. Because as we've covered so many times on this podcast, this system is not infallible. It's fucked up. It's just run by people, and people are fucked up and they make mistakes, and it's extremely unfair. And we're going to be talking now about some factors that impact the integrity of convictions. And we're going to see just some of the reasons why our criminal justice system is so unfair, and talk about it. So just zooming out here, Addie, go ahead.
I wanted to say one thing too, just kind of about the factors impacting the integrity of convictions, and something that I think really troubles me with appeals like Jamal's and the argument, that was presented by his attorneys about sufficiency of the evidence. The Court of Appeals in Michigan, they noted in the brief, or I should say in the ruling, I think a standard that I think is kind of helpful for people to understand about kind of how difficult these cases are, and certainly a factor that I think is worth kind of highlighting is the different ways in which the court holds the defense and the prosecution to kind of different standards. And, a pretty basic one is that at the trial court level, for someone to be found guilty, there's the burden of proof aspect on the part of the state. But for the appeal, the sufficiency of evidence argument that his counsel presented, I found myself very much kind of grappling with that aspect of it, because on appeal, according to the opinion, the evidence is supposed to be viewed in a light most favorable to the prosecution. And that's hard, I think, for just a defense attorney to kind of, grapple with. I think it should be harder for more people to just kind of digest that if somebody is saying that they were prosecuted in a manner or they were convicted in a manner where there was insufficient evidence against them, the pendulum swings where then the evidence is supposed to be viewed in a light most favorable to the prosecution.
But if we're going to be real about it, the pendulum is already swung that way. We like to think that people are presumed innocent, but if we're being real as criminal defense attorneys, we know that we're working against the presumption of guilt, right? If somebody's sitting in that chair and has been accused of a crime, they must have done something wrong, I would say is probably what most people consciously or subconsciously believe.
And I just found this sentence, I found kind of parts of it a little bit just kind of sad. And I just wanted to read this part where it says, defendant's argument requires us to disregard the trial court's credibility determinations and to look at the evidence in a light most favorable to the defendant. This argument ignores the standard with which we review claims of sufficiency of evidence. They cite to the case, which has the holding that the court reviews the evidence in a light most favorable to the prosecution. That's kind of always the argument that I've heard various prosecutors make in, my jurisdiction about how evidence is always supposed to be viewed in a manner that's favorable to the state, and I disagree with that. And also that all evidence is, to some degree incriminating. Again, I kind of disagree with that, but I found that hard, especially for somebody who's on appeal saying, hey, I was convicted in a manner in which there was not enough evidence. And they're like, well, hey, the evidence that was there, we just have to view that most favorably to what the previous court determined, and then make an assumption or conclude that has to be viewed to be supportive of the state's case. And as a defense attorney, I mean, this is just kind of a fundamental concept, but I just don't think that people really understand how that plays out on appeal, especially if they don't have a background in the law. It is hard to read sometimes, where people, the other things that I just want people to consider with Jamal's case and just cases that are similar. It's hard when I've always felt sometimes with cases that the goalposts move sometimes, where it's like, okay, you're going to appeal, really your issues needed to be presented at the previous court. So we can't really do anything here. And
it's all by design, man.
yeah, it's just really hard to stomach sometimes. And I think whether or not
Yeah.
you have an opinion on whether or not somebody did something or not, um, the way it plays out for people and just kind of the burden that we are held to as defense attorneys, to just preserve every issue and to do the best that we can. And if we appeal, it's not enough for our clients. And it's just crushing how that plays out for people, not only the people who are the defendants in these cases and our clients, but also I have a tremendous amount of sympathy for appellate attorneys who are like, hey, we disagree with the result that this person got, and we are challenging it going forward. And I think sometimes people forget that a person's case has a life that goes beyond just the trial. Like, somebody trying to get what they view as a just outcome, or people challenging a conviction, is a really painful process. And it is defeating sometimes because you don't get results. And the hope that is involved in that sometimes, I think, is just, it's an aspect of the criminal legal system that is very, very hard. And I think just keeping in mind the rules on appeal and the way in which evidence on appeal is considered, is something that I think people should also just keep in mind when they're viewing the factors that go towards why convictions are upheld, why convictions are, why someone's convicted in the first place. And to your point, I think we are a little bit cynical about all of it, because we work in that world, and we see how this plays out for people who we represent, and also how it plays out for us when we're doing the work and trying to get whether it's justice or just the right outcome that we think is the outcome for our clients. There's a lot to it, and it can make you very cynical because it feels like it's actively working against you.
Well, the facts kind of, let's dive into some depressing statistics now. That was a perfect start off. So, so zooming out and just talking about a few of the factors that can just generally impact the integrity of convictions in the criminal legal system. A lot of this information I got from the book, The Fear of Too Much Justice by Stephen Bright and James Kuwak, and I highly recommend it. It is a very fascinating book. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is plea bargaining. So Addie, this will not surprise you, but 97% of federal cases and 94% of state criminal cases are resolved with guilty pleas. Why is this? These are just some things I was kind of thinking about. So I think, sometimes the prosecutor will overcharge somebody so that they can wheel and deal, and the person will be more susceptible to just saying okay, F it, dismiss those, whatever, 2 charges and I'll plead to 1, and at least the state gets some kind of conviction, right? Other times people are against some pretty hardcore mandatory minimums, which we know are laws which certain states enact, which essentially tie the judge's hands when it comes to sentencing for particular offenses. So they'll say, okay, judge, if somebody pleads guilty to this crime or is found guilty of this crime, you have to sentence them to X, Y, and Z. And so particularly, Addie and I both practice in our respective state systems, but I understand that the federal system has some pretty hardcore mandatory minimums for drug crimes, for example.
Absolutely.
And so that can make it a lot easier for prosecutors to talk somebody into a plea deal as well. What else did I think about here?
Trial tax.
Oh shit. Yes, dude. I thought this was so interesting. Okay. So another consideration, something called trial tax. Basically, if somebody decides to go to trial and loses, I would say a pretty common refrain. I don't know what I'm trying to say. Thing I hear is that, it's very likely that you're going to get a higher sentence, right? The prosecutor is likely going to recommend more time. And then,
I think that's so
regardless
wrong,
of
by
on,
the way.
yeah, yeah. And then the judge, is likely to accordingly impose more time. Um, And this checks out. An analysis of federal convictions found that defendants convicted by trial received prison sentences 64% longer than they would have received if they had pled guilty.
I want to say I don't practice in federal court, but I was talking about this exact issue with somebody who does not that long ago. And I think by design, I've certainly had cases at the state court level where I think trial tax was certainly an issue, but my understanding in what I do know about the federal system and the conversation I was having with somebody who works in that system is that you are very much encouraged to negotiate your case because of like enhancements on the backside if you don't take accountability for your offense, which I think kind of operates the same as like a trial tax. I think they're kind of together, right? In terms of the federal sentencing guidelines, from what I briefly recall about my introduction to them, it's kind of like a grid, it's kind of like a box in terms of the type of offense and all these other factors. And I think that a factor that's considered with federal sentencing is that accountability piece, meaning, plea negotiations essentially. And it just makes me, it's shocking that it is kind of infringing upon this. I've always viewed it as it's really compelling people to not exercise a constitutional right. And so you're getting
For sure.
punished for exercising a constitutional right, being the right to go to trial. And that doesn't sit
I
super
mean,
well
it's
with me
not
either.
always true. I will say, like, I have had a trial where my person lost, but the judge imposed a lesser sentence than the prosecutor had offered for just a straight up plea guilty as charged. So it's not a hard and fast rule, I guess, depending on how reasonable the prosecutor's recommendations are. But it's certainly a consideration that I always tell people to think about, because it is a real thing. Um, so, another thing that I have found really impacts my clients' decisions on whether to resolve their case or not is just like, or resolve their case through a plea or go to trial, is just like the time that it takes, right? Like, if you actually want to go to trial, I need to have sufficient time to, number one, get the evidence, which sometimes takes much longer than it should. And then two, review it all. Three, like write any motions that are necessary. And then they actually have to, go to the trial date, which is, however long down the road. And a lot of people get super stressed out having criminal cases hang over their head. And if people are in jail, they just want to get the fuck out of jail. Right.
Oh, of course.
And yeah, I would say that's a huge motivator for people.
Yeah. And also just, I think some people are, um, I'm just going to kind of summarize all of the different things. I think people just fear kind of goes into people's decision to resolve a case, whether it's fear of the unknown in terms of, trial being kind of an unknown, whether it's unknown based upon like, how it typically works is that an offer will get presented. And if somebody leaves their case up for trial, the state views that as a rejection of the offer. And then the plea deal's off the table. And then the prosecutor will say to the trial tax portion of it that they're no longer bound by the previous offer that they've extended so they can change their recommendations. I think people who are going through the unknowns of having a criminal charge are wanting some security and some answers and some like knowns in terms of like, okay, if I resolve this way, I know exactly what the state is asking for. I might get an agreement that binds the court. So maybe they'll get like a binding agreement. So they have like a known outcome. And I think the unknown really scares people, whether it's the unknown of staying in jail or the unknown of just not knowing what their sentence is going to be. I think kind of the fear mongering that takes place with plea bargaining really encourages a lot of people to choose the option that they have more control over. Whether that's right or wrong, I think that's the decision that defendants are afforded the opportunity to make. But it is kind of sad that I think that is a huge motivator for them.
It's a really good point. Another thing that can impact the integrity of convictions, bad prosecutors, right? Prosecutors have all of the power in this fucking system, man. They have access to all of that information gathered by law enforcement. Of course, they have discovery obligations and they're supposed to turn over evidence that could be favorable to the defendant. But like, you just like how there are good people and bad people, there are good lawyers and there are bad lawyers. And like, you know, prosecutors aren't always ethical, and that can really fuck with people, and it's terrible. A bad prosecutor may know that they have a bad case. You know, they may give a defendant very little time to decide whether or not to accept a plea offer. And this would essentially like prevent their attorney from being able to conduct like a complete investigation into the facts. Anything to add about bad prosecutors, Addie?
I think that I've probably mentioned it several times on here before, but I think it really surprises people when I'm talking to people kind of casually in my life about how my job works, where it's like, yeah, I don't really get to make decisions about what charges are brought. I'm just like kind of always in reaction mode as a defense attorney. Like there's very few times where we're actually on the offensive in our cases. So in terms of what charges get brought, what charges get, what the offer looks like, we can always pitch a counter offer if our client agrees to that and we have an offer, counter offer in mind. But at the end of the day, whether or not that comes on the table is always up to the prosecutor. And so, bad prosecutors, also just stubborn prosecutors, it makes it hard because defense attorneys, more often than not, we're just like the people in the middle. And I think people think we have more control than we do. We don't really deal the cards. We just get them dealt to us and we kind of play them to the best of our ability.
Well said.
But we're not the people shuffling the deck. Yeah.
Well said. The last factor we want to touch on is race. In 2010, almost 1 in every 10 African American men aged 25 to 29 were incarcerated. Another study indicated that 1 in every 3 Black men have been convicted of a felony. So why is this? The authors of the book, The Fear of Too Much Justice, explained that police are far more likely to stop, search, arrest, assault, and kill Black people than white people. And this is to a degree that really cannot be explained by crime rates or poverty. So just straight up, more people of color get funneled into the criminal legal system by law enforcement on the front end. I think it's also worth noting that most lawyers are white, right? Like according to the ABA, only 14.1% of all lawyers in 2020 were people of color. And so, there's all this talk about unconscious or subconscious bias. We don't really have time to get into it today, but, I think it's worth noting that, our biases, it impacts our decision. Thank you. And who the decision makers are matters. And I also think representation matters. Like for criminal defendants to not see people who look like them making decisions that directly impact their lives is really troubling. There's also the issue with some prosecutors striking non-white potential jurors from panels. And that's a whole nother thing we could do a whole episode on.
Isn't that a bad issue?
Yes. But yes, really, guys, in conclusion, Jamal Moore's case, along with these systemic issues, really just invite us to critically examine the criminal legal system and, continually question how convictions are obtained and maintained. So we just invite you to do that with us. And thank you for joining us.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. Yeah, it looks really cute.
Cute. We love cute. We love cute on this podcast.
Cute on this podcast.
Our one non-controversial opinion.
Aw.
Cute is universal.
Okay. Amen.